Everyone around her thought they knew who she was. That's what made the truth so shocking, because sometimes the most dangerous secrets are not hidden in dark alleyways or back rooms. They live in broad daylight, smiling at you, waving as life passes by. To the outside world, her life looked polished and peaceful. A successful beauty therapist, a growing client list, a carefully curated image of calm confidence and quiet prosperity. The kind of person people trust instantly. The kind of life others scroll past and admire without suspicion. Every detail appeared ordinary in the best possible way. And that was exactly the point. Her days were filled with appointments, conversations, routines that felt stable and predictable. Laughter inside softly lit rooms, conversations about plans, families, futures. Nothing about her lifestyle appeared risky. Nothing raised alarms. And yet, beneath the surface of that calm routine, another world existed, one that few could have ever imagined intersecting with her own. Double lives rarely begin with dramatic shifts. They grow quietly, slowly, one choice at a time. A conversation that seems harmless, a favor that feels like a shortcut, a justification that sounds reasonable in the moment. People don't wake up one day and decide to replace everything they are. They drift there, step by step, convincing themselves each move is temporary. What made her situation so unsettling was the contrast. While friends saw stability, others saw opportunity. While clients saw trust, powerful networks saw access. While neighbors saw routine, unseen systems saw movement. The same qualities that made her seem dependable also made her useful in ways no one around her could detect. There is a strange comfort that comes with secrecy in the beginning. It feels like control, like having layers no one else can touch. It creates the illusion of power, the belief that one version of life can exist without disturbing the other. And at first, it often works. For a while, both worlds move side by side without colliding. But secrecy has weight. And the heavier it becomes, the harder it is to carry without leaving traces. People involved in hidden networks don't always act like villains from stories. Often they appear polite, measured, and patient. They understand that reliability is more valuable than force. They build influence not through fear at first, but through access, through opportunity, through the promise that nothing will change, only improve. That promise is what quietly redefines reality. What looked like success continued to grow. More comfort, more confidence, more reassurance that everything was under control. And when life appears to be moving upward, it becomes easier to ignore the warning signs beneath your feet. The outside world reinforces the illusion by reflecting admiration back at you. And admiration can be blinding. What no one seeing her public life could understand was the pressure that silence creates. Every normal conversation became layered. Every ordinary day required careful balance. Every routine moment carried the responsibility of secrecy. And over time, that kind of pressure reshapes how a person thinks. Safety starts to feel dependent on maintaining the act. The most dangerous part of a double life isn't the risk of discovery. It's the moment when it begins to feel normal. Once secrecy becomes routine, judgment changes. Lines blur, boundaries soften. The extraordinary begins to feel ordinary, and what once seemed impossible slowly becomes acceptable. Trust plays a powerful role in this transformation. Trust shared in fragments, trust built through repetition, trust reinforced through familiarity. Once trust feels established, doubt feels unnecessary. And when doubt fades, vulnerability grows. From the outside, her life remained untouched. There were no visible signs of strain,
no obvious signals that anything was wrong. That is the illusion most people never see coming, the idea that danger always announces itself. In reality, danger often hides inside what looks most stable. What makes stories like this so unsettling is not the shock of the revelation, but how long everything remained hidden. How many normal moments quietly coexisted with a reality no one else could see? How many smiles existed alongside silence? How many plans were made without anyone realizing what had already been set in motion? And then, suddenly, without drama or warning, the two worlds collided. It didn't begin with chaos. It began with interruption, a stop, a pause in a routine that had repeated countless times before, the kind of moment that should have been unremarkable, the kind of moment that had always ended with everything continuing as normal. But this time, normal did not return. In an instant, the carefully constructed separation between appearance and reality was gone. What had been hidden could no longer remain unseen. The life that had been admired and unquestioned was suddenly surrounded by uncertainty. For the first time, the image the world knew began to fracture. People who had only ever known one version of her were forced to confront a truth that felt incompatible with everything they believed. Questions spread faster than answers. Shock traveled faster than understanding, and the familiar became unfamiliar in a single heartbeat. For her, everything changed without any visible transformation. The same face, the same name, the same history, but none of it could exist untouched anymore. The shield of normality had fallen away, exposing what had always been beneath it. This is the quiet tragedy of living two lives. When the truth surfaces, it doesn't just reveal the hidden world, it rewrites the visible one. Every memory becomes reinterpreted, every moment becomes suspect, every certainty dissolves into question. And yet, what remains deeply human in this story is not the mystery, it is the vulnerability beneath it. The reality that no one begins believing they will lose everything. People move forward believing they are protecting something, their future, their stability, their identity. They don't see the moment when protection transforms into risk. The double life does not collapse because it is fragile. It collapses because it cannot grow forever. The split between reality and appearance eventually becomes too wide to hold. And when that moment arrives, it doesn't just expose actions, it exposes the cost of pretending. The people left behind are forced to reconcile two versions of the same person, the one they loved and trusted, and the one they never knew existed. There is no easy bridge between those truths, only confusion, only grief for the certainty that once felt unshakable. This is not just a story about crime, it is about identity, about how easily a life can be reshaped without changing its surface, about how success can disguise danger, and about how trust, once broken, leaves questions that never fully disappear. Because when the mask finally falls, what hurts most is not what was hidden, it's how long no one saw it.
Because when the mask finally falls, what hurts most is not what was hidden, it's how long no one saw it. And once that realization settles in, a second truth begins to take shape, quieter but just as powerful. The truth that very few people arrive in such situations suddenly. Most are drawn in slowly, through trust, temptation, and choices that feel small when they are first made. At the beginning, nothing feels dangerous. It feels like opportunity, a conversation that promises ease instead of struggle, a suggestion that sounds like a shortcut rather than a risk. It doesn't arrive with pressure or threats. It arrives with reassurance, with calm voices and confident plans, with the suggestion that this is temporary, manageable, and safe. Trust is built first, not all at once, but piece by piece. Familiar faces, repeated interactions, favors exchanged without urgency. Over time, reliability replaces doubt. Once reliability is established, Boundaries soften without being noticed. And once boundaries soften, the idea of just once begins to feel harmless. This is where the slope becomes slippery, not because the first step is dramatic, but because it feels ordinary. There is always a moment when someone believes they are in control of how far they go, that they will know when to stop, that they are choosing rather than being pulled. But control, once tested by reward, rarely remains unchanged. The temptation is not always financial in the beginning. Sometimes it's emotional. The feeling of being valued, the feeling of being trusted with something exclusive, the sense of importance that comes from being included in a world that feels hidden and powerful. These emotions can be more persuasive than money ever could be. And once involvement begins, it often doesn't feel like involvement at all. It feels like assistance, like helping someone out, like solving a problem. Language matters in these early stages. Words are chosen carefully to keep danger sounding distant. Risk is reframed as routine, and once routine forms, hesitation disappears. What's especially dangerous about gradual involvement is how it changes identity without changing appearance. Outwardly, nothing shifts. The same routines continue, the same roles are played, the same expectations are met. But internally, perception begins to split. One life becomes what is shown, the other becomes what is managed. Over time, small tasks turn into responsibilities. Responsibilities turn into expectations. Expectations turn into obligations. And once obligation forms, walking away no longer feels neutral. It begins to feel like betrayal or danger or loss. Fear plays a quiet role here, but not at first. Early on, fear feels distant. The focus remains on benefit, on progress, on the belief that everything is still under control. Fear does not arrive as a warning, it arrives as an afterthought. What replaces fear in those early months or years is normalization. The extraordinary becomes familiar, the hidden becomes routine, and routine is powerful. It makes even the most unlikely situation feel stable. People often imagine that those who become involved in hidden networks must be reckless or driven by chaos. The reality is often the opposite. Many are cautious, they calculate, they weigh risks, they convince themselves they are being careful, and that belief becomes the justification for each next step. The trap is not that people aren't thinking, it's that they are thinking within a shrinking frame. The more involved someone becomes, the fewer alternatives they consider. Options that once felt available slowly disappear from view. And when alternatives vanish, staying feels like the only choice left. Pressure increases quietly. Expectations grow. Communication becomes more direct. What was once gentle suggestion becomes firm instruction, still calm, still controlled, but no longer optional. And by the time that shift is recognized, turning back no longer feels simple. Power inside such systems doesn't always look like dominance. Often, it looks like certainty. The person who seems to know exactly what will happen next. The person who removes uncertainty from the air. In moments of doubt, certainty feels like safety. And people will follow safety even into danger if it feels stable enough. The deeper someone moves into this world, the harder it becomes to separate their original self from the role they now occupy. At first, the role feels temporary. Then it feels necessary. Eventually, it starts to feel permanent. The most unsettling shift happens when the reasons for staying change. What once felt like choice begins to feel like obligation. What once felt like advantage begins to feel like protection. And what once felt like opportunity begins to feel like survival. At that point, the original identity, the person before any of this began, starts to feel distant. Memories of that life feel smaller, less relevant, almost unreal. And when identity shifts this way, perspective shifts with it. Risk no longer feels abstract, it feels familiar, and familiar risk is easier to live with than unfamiliar uncertainty. People on the outside often ask, why didn't someone just walk away sooner? The honest answer is rarely simple. Walking away doesn't just mean stopping in action. It means stepping into a version of life that no longer feels fully safe. It means facing questions without answers. It means accepting the unknown over the known. And the known, even when dangerous, can feel more predictable than the unknown ever could be. Over time, fear does enter the picture, but by then, it no longer functions as a warning, it functions as a motivator to continue, to avoid consequences, to maintain stability, to keep everything from collapsing at once. This is how temptation quietly becomes entrapment, not through sudden force, but through slow dependency, through repetition, through the erosion of alternatives. The tragedy in this process is not just the destination, it's the long stretch of time when everything still feels negotiable, when each step is small enough to rationalize, when each warning feels distant enough to ignore. No one sets out believing they will become trapped. They believe they will manage risk, that they will adapt, that they will stay ahead of consequences. But consequences have patience. They do not rush. They allow systems to build. They allow habits to grow. They allow confidence to settle in. And when they finally arrive, they arrive not as a question, but as a certainty. By the time realization fully forms, by the time someone truly understands how far they've drifted from the person they once were, the space to return has often narrowed beyond reach. And that is the quiet heartbreak beneath stories like this. They are not built on a single act of recklessness. They are built on 1,000 small choices that never felt big enough to destroy a life, until they did. The slope is always gentler than it appears from the bottom, and by the time its steepness becomes visible, the climb back feels unbearable. This is the reality behind trust and temptation. They do not announce the danger they carry. They disguise it as comfort, as success, as stability. And by the time they reveal their true weight, the path forward has already been chosen, not in one dramatic moment, but in a long series of quiet ones. And it is along that quiet path, paved with justified decisions and soft compromises, that people often travel the farthest from where they ever intended to go.
And it is along that quiet path, paved with justified decisions and soft compromises, that people often travel the farthest from where they ever intended to go. What changes most along that journey isn't just circumstance, it's perception. The rules that once felt unbreakable begin to feel negotiable. The lines that once felt solid begin to blur. And through that blur, choices are no longer measured by right and wrong, but by necessity and timing. By this stage, the outside world still sees the same person, the same routines, the same face, the same version of normal. But inside, there is constant calculation. Every message is weighed. Every movement is considered. Every silence is interpreted. Life becomes a series of adjustments rather than decisions. What once felt like momentum now feels like maintenance. The goal is no longer growth, it is balance. Keeping everything from tipping too far in either direction. Keeping suspicion low. Keeping expectations met. Keeping fear from rising too high. This constant balancing act takes a quiet toll. Sleep becomes light. Thoughts race ahead of time. Even moments of rest feel rented. There is always the sense that life is no longer fully owned, only managed. And yet, from the outside, success still appears intact. Comfort still seems present. Stability still looks real. This contrast is what makes the situation so isolating. There is nowhere to openly place the weight of what's being carried. Confession feels impossible. Explanation feels dangerous. And isolation, once it settles in, becomes its own form of captivity. The most difficult part of long-term involvement in hidden systems is not fear of exposure. It is the erosion of self-trust. Over time, a person begins to doubt their own instincts. They question whether they would even recognize the right moment to leave if it arrived. Every delay is justified. Every pause is explained. The future becomes something to think about later, always later. And later stretches into months, then into years. Hope doesn't disappear. It simply changes shape. it becomes quieter, less bold, no longer about escape, but about survival without collapse, about soft landings instead of new beginnings. When pressure increases from the outside, it is rarely sudden. It arrives as subtle shifts in tone, slight delays in communication, small changes in routine, the absence of reassurance where it used to be freely given, and that absence can be louder than any threat. At this point, the mind begins scanning for signals, reading between words, interpreting gaps, searching for meaning in timing. Life becomes layered with unspoken questions. Every phone vibration brings a small surge of alertness. Every unanswered message carries a shadow of possibility. The world shrinks to the size of anticipation. Control, which once felt solid, now feels fragile. And fragility makes people more compliant than force ever could. It is in these moments that many realize the truth too late, that the situation they once believed they were shaping has been shaping them all along. And yet, even with this realization, leaving still doesn't feel simple, because what lies outside now feels unfamiliar. The person that once existed before all of this feels like a stranger, and returning to that version of life feels like stepping into someone else's story. There is grief in that awareness, grief for the life that might have remained uncomplicated, grief for the version of self that made decisions without calculating hidden outcomes, grief for the simplicity that no longer feels reachable. This grief is quiet. It doesn't announce itself as sadness. It shows up as exhaustion, as detachment, as moments of empty focus where the body moves but the mind lags behind. And yet, still, things continue, because stopping would mean facing everything at once. And most people do not fear consequences as much as they fear sudden confrontation with their own truth. Time, however, keeps moving, and with time comes tightening space. Systems grow more complex, routes shorten, risks concentrate, the room for error narrows. By the time pressure becomes visible in the outside world, it has already existed for a long time inside. Investigations do not always announce themselves. They begin quietly. Patterns noticed, movements logged, connections mapped. While one world continues in routine, another begins to observe. And that is the great imbalance of such lives. One side moves on belief and familiarity, the other on structure and patience. One side trusts repetition, the other studies deviation. People often imagine that exposure arrives with drama, with chaos, with sudden collapse. More often it arrives with stillness, with a moment that feels oddly ordinary until it isn't. A routine stop, a casual question, a delay that feels minor. And in that pause, the hidden layers begin to surface. When that moment comes, shock is rarely loud. It is heavy. It moves slowly through thought. A realization that the life maintained in parallel can no longer remain separate. In that instant, fear does not explode, it condenses. It becomes sharp and focused. And with that focus comes a strange clarity, the understanding that nothing can now return to what it was. The weight of accountability feels different from the weight of risk. Risk is lived with tension. Accountability is felt with gravity. It pulls downward rather than forward. At this stage, explanations no longer serve to protect. Secrets no longer serve to stabilize. Everything that once felt like a shield begins to feel like evidence of how far the path has gone. And yet, even here, there is still something deeply human at work. The instinct to make sense of what has happened, to look back and search for the moment where a different choice might have changed everything. But hindsight does not unfold in straight lines. It loops. It revisits. It rewrites. It places significance on moments that once felt harmless. Conversations once forgotten suddenly feel charged with meaning. the mind reconstructs its own story in reverse. This process can be more difficult than consequences themselves, because consequences arrive from the outside, but reinterpretation comes from within, and it does not rest. There is a reckoning that goes beyond outcome. It is the quiet inventory of self, the question not of what happened, but how it became possible. Some find strength in that reckoning. Others feel only its weight. What remains undeniable is this: lives shaped by secrecy are not undone in a single moment. Their impact echoes in memory, in relationships, in identity. Even when the story reaches an external conclusion, the internal one continues. The world may move on quickly, headlines may fade, attention may drift, but for the individual who walked that path, time moves differently. It stretches around moments of recognition. It slows around memory. There is no dramatic moral hidden in stories like this, only a slow accumulation of cause and effect. No single step defines the journey, only the pattern does. And that is why these stories resonate far beyond the personal, because within them live questions that apply to many lives, even those far removed from hidden worlds. How far can small choices travel? How quietly can identity shift? How long can control be believed before it is revealed as illusion? These are not questions of crime alone. They are questions of human nature, of ambition, of vulnerability, of belonging, of fear, of trust. And in the end, what remains is not just the story of what happened, but the reminder of how easily a life can move from visibility into shadow without ever feeling like it crossed the line at all, until the line, once faint and distant, stands suddenly behind rather than ahead. And by then, the path back is no longer a matter of distance. It is a matter of self.